Welcome back to another quiet journey through the shadows of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Tonight, we're going to trace the complete story of one man whose actions rippled through decades, whose obsessions twisted innocent entertainment into something far darker, and whose presence lingers in every corner of this franchise like a stain that refuses to fade. This is the story of William Afton, the man behind the mask, the architect of nightmares, the serial killer who simply refused to stay dead. Whether you're settling in for the night, letting these familiar horrors wash over you like a dark lullaby, or diving deep into the lore for the first time, this will be a comprehensive look at every confirmed detail, every twisted turn, and every resurrection of the man who became Springtrap, Scraptrap, Glitchtrap, and so much more, and will move chronologically through his life, from ambitious entrepreneur to mechanical monster, examining not just what he did, but the why behind the madness, the how of his impossible survival, and the legacy he left burning in his wake. Before we begin, if you enjoy this style of deep, atmospheric storytelling that unfolds slowly like fog rolling across forgotten pizzerias, feel free to like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something wonderfully strange about knowing this same dark tale is being whispered into ears around the world, one hushed night at a time. Let's begin. The man behind the mask. In the early 1970s, in what we can only assume was somewhere in Utah based on scattered evidence throughout the series, a man named William Afton stood at the beginning of what would become a legacy soaked in tragedy and horror. But before the murders, before the animatronics, before the Springlock failures and the Remnant experiments, William Afton was, by all appearances, simply a businessman with a dream. He wasn't alone in this dream. William had a partner, a man named Henry Emily, whose brilliance with robotics and engineering would prove to be both a gift and a curse to the world they were building together. The two men couldn't have been more different in temperament and approach, yet they complemented each other in ways that made their early success almost inevitable. Henry was the creative genius, the inventor whose mind could bring mechanical wonders to life with an almost artistic sensibility. William, on the other hand, handled the business side of things, managing the finances, the paperwork, the pragmatic concerns that kept a company running. Together, they founded Fazbear Entertainment and opened their first location, Fredbear's Family Diner. This wasn't some massive chain operation from the start. No, it was humble, almost quaint in its ambitions. A family diner where parents could bring their children for birthday parties, where animatronic performers would sing and dance and make magic happen in the eyes of wide-eyed kids clutching pizza slices and balloons. It was the kind of place that smelled like pepperoni and sounded like laughter, where the biggest concern should have been whether you'd ordered enough arcade tokens or if the animatronics needed their routines adjusted for the next show. And the centerpiece of Fredbear's Family Diner was the Springlock suits, an innovation that Henry Emily had designed and William had helped refine for commercial use. These weren't your standard animatronic costumes. They were something far more complex, far more versatile, and, as would become horrifically clear, far more dangerous. The Springlock suits could function in two modes. As fully automated animatronics, they could perform on stage, moving independently, entertaining crowds with their programmed songs and choreographed movements. But with the turn of a hand crank, the internal animatronic components could be compressed, wound back against the interior walls of the suit, creating just enough space for a human performer to climb inside and wear the costume. This dual functionality was revolutionary for its time, and it meant maximum flexibility with minimum investment. During peak hours, employees could wear the suits for meet and greets, photo opportunities, and intimate birthday party performances. During automated shows, those same suits could perform without human intervention. It was genius from a business perspective, a perfect marriage of technology and practicality. The two primary Springlock suits were Fredbear, a golden bear with a purple hat and bow tie, and Spring Bonnie, a yellow rabbit with a similarly cheerful design. William Afton had a particular fondness for the Spring Bonnie suit. He would often wear it himself during the diner's early days, performing for children, moving through the restaurant with what witnesses would later describe as surprising grace and confidence. Some people said the character seemed more alive when William wore it than when it moved on its own. There was something about his performance, they said, that made Spring Bonnie feel real, feel present, feel almost hungry in its interactions with the children who flocked around it. But beneath this veneer of family-friendly entertainment, beneath the smell of pizza and the sound of arcade games, something else was brewing. William Afton had a family of his own, a wife whose name has been lost to obscurity in the official records. Though she existed, she was there, she was real, and 3 children. The oldest was Michael, a boy who would grow to carry the weight of his father's sins on his shoulders for the rest of his unnaturally long life. The youngest was a boy, whose name we never learn in the games, referred to by fans simply as the crying child, a fragile soul who feared his father's creations with a terror that seemed almost prophetic. And between them was Elizabeth, a girl with red hair and green eyes, who loved her father's work with an admiration that would ultimately prove fatal. William Afton presented himself to the world as a family man, as a successful entrepreneur, as someone building something wholesome and good. He had the ruddy geniality of a financially shrewd Santa Claus, as one account described him. He was robust, lively, the kind of man who could convince you of almost anything with his confident, reassuring voice. He smiled easily. He shook hands firmly. He knew how to make people comfortable, how to make them trust him, how to make them believe that Fredbear's family diner was the safest and happiest place their children could be. But there was something underneath, a darkness that Henry Emily, for all his brilliance, couldn't see or chose not to see in those early days. William watched Henry with his daughter Charlotte, watched the way Henry poured love and care into both his creations and his child, and something curdled inside him. Was it jealousy? Was it resentment at feeling overshadowed by Henry's technical genius? Was it frustration at being the business half of the partnership, the pragmatic one, the one who dealt with spreadsheets and contracts while Henry got to create magic? Or was it something that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge? The Springlock suits, for all their innovative design, they had a fatal flaw that should have been addressed before they ever saw commercial use. The locks that held the animatronic components in place when someone was wearing the suit were triggered by moisture. Even the smallest amount of water, even the condensation from breath or the dampness of sweat, could cause the locks to loosen. And when spring locks loosened, they released with catastrophic force, allowing the compressed animatronic parts to snap back into their original positions. If someone was inside the suit when this happened, the results were exactly as gruesome as you're imagining. Metal rods, gears, wires, and articulated joints designed to move a heavy animatronic would slam into flesh and bone with crushing force. It would be agonizing it would be bloody, and depending on which parts failed first, it might not even be quick, and training tapes were distributed to employees, explaining in calm procedural voices how to wind the locks properly, how to avoid moisture, how to be extremely careful when wearing the suits. But the warnings existed because the danger was real, present, and had likely already caused incidents that the company was trying to prevent from recurring. These weren't theoretical safety concerns. These were lessons learned in blood. The diner was successful enough in those early years. Children came, parents paid, the animatronics performed, and Fazbear Entertainment grew from a single location to plans for expansion. But success in business doesn't mean peace at home, and for William Afton, something was festering. Some accounts suggest he felt overshadowed by Henry's technical accomplishments, and others hint at a growing obsession with the animatronics themselves, with what they represented, with the way they moved and performed and almost seemed alive. And then there was his youngest son, the crying child, who was terrified of everything his father had built. The boy would tremble and weep at the sight of the animatronics. He'd hide under tables during birthday parties. He clutched a Fredbear plush like a lifeline, never knowing that his father had embedded a camera and speaker inside it, using it to watch him, to monitor him, to speak to him in that soft, distant voice that only made the boy's fears worse. Michael, the older brother, found his younger sibling's fear amusing. He would torment the boy, wearing a foxy mask to scare him at home, orchestrating pranks with his friends, all of them wearing animatronic masks, cornering the crying child and making his life a waking nightmare. And William watched it happen. He watched through hidden cameras. He watched and did nothing to stop it, perhaps seeing it as a way to toughen his son up, to make him overcome his irrational fears of machines that were meant to bring joy. But fear, especially in a child, especially when it's that deep and consuming, isn't always irrational. Sometimes it's prophetic. The stage was set. Fredbear's family diner was thriving. The Springlock suits were performing. The Afton family was, on the surface, the picture of success. And Henry Emily continued inventing, continued creating, continued building things that brought wonder into the world, never suspecting that his partner was about to transform their shared dream into something unspeakably dark. Because William Afton, and the man behind the mask, was about to take his first steps down a path from which there would be no return. A path that would be paved with the bodies of children, lit by fires that never quite consumed him, and haunted by spirits that would pursue him long past the point where death should have claimed him. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a bang, but with a bite. The first tragedies, 1983. The year 1983 would prove to be a turning point, a year when the foundations of everything William Afton and Henry Emily had built began to crack and splinter. It started with a birthday party, as so many stories in this franchise do, but this one would end in blood and horror that would reverberate through decades. The crying child, William's youngest son, was turning another year older, and though he showed no excitement about the celebration planned at Fredbear's family diner, if anything, the poor boy seemed more terrified than usual in the days leading up to it. His older brother Michael and Michael's friends had been relentless in their torment, wearing masks of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy, cornering the boy at every opportunity, feeding his nightmares with their cruel pranks. The crying child had tried to hide, tried to avoid the party altogether, but Michael and his friends had other plans. On that fateful day at Fredbear's family diner, with the restaurant full of children and parents, with balloons and decorations and the cheerful automated voice of Fredbear singing birthday songs, Michael and his masked friends found their victim hiding under a table. What happened next was meant to be the ultimate scare, and the final prank that would somehow cure the boy of his fears through sheer exposure. They grabbed him, lifted him up as he struggled and cried, and carried him toward the stage where Fredbear stood in the middle of a performance. The other children at the party stopped to watch. Parents looked up from their conversations, and Michael, caught up in the moment, in the laughter of his friends, in the thrill of the prank, didn't think about the consequences as they lifted his younger brother higher, positioning his head directly in front of Fredbear's open mouth. The children chanted for a kiss, for Fredbear to give the birthday boy a big kiss, and they pushed the crying child's head into the animatronic's mouth as a joke. They didn't know about spring locks. They didn't know about moisture sensors. They didn't know that the tears streaming down the boy's face, the humidity of his panicked breath, could trigger catastrophic failure. But William Afton knew. If he was there, watching, he knew exactly what was about to happen. And if he wasn't there, he would learn soon enough what his creations were capable of when safety protocols failed. The spring locks in Fredbear's jaw mechanism released with mechanical precision. The animatronic's mouth clamped shut with a force designed to move a several hundred-pound metal head through repeated performances. But instead of closing on empty air or a costume prop, those jaws closed on a child's skull. The sound, witnesses would later struggle to describe, trying to find words for the crack of bone, the mechanical whir of gears, the sudden absence of the birthday boy's screams as they transformed into something else entirely. Blood spattered across Fredbear's golden fur, across the stage, across Michael and his friends, as they stumbled backward in horror, their masks suddenly feeling suffocating, their prank having crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Paramedics arrived. The boy was rushed to a hospital, and there, in a room filled with the soft beep of monitors and the antiseptic smell of medical equipment, the crying child slipped into a coma. The damage was catastrophic. The frontal lobe was compromised. There was bleeding in the brain. The prognosis was grim. Michael stayed by his brother's bedside, the weight of what he'd done crashing down on him in waves. He apologized through tears, his voice breaking, begging his little brother to wake up and to forgive him, to give him a chance to make it right. The Fredbear plush sat on the bedside table, that beloved toy that had been the crying child's constant companion, and through its hidden speaker, William Afton's voice whispered in tones that were somehow both comforting and distant. "I will put you back together," the voice said, a promise or a threat, or perhaps both. And then the flat line, the steady beep becoming a single, sustained tone. The crying child's death was confirmed by the date visible in the background of the hospital room scene, playing on a television showing the Fredbear and Friends television show, with its 1983 copyright date. The Bite of 83, as it would come to be known, claimed its victim, and Fredbear's family diner would never be the same. But the tragedy didn't end there, and because while William was dealing with the loss of his youngest son, while the investigation into the incident was ongoing, while parents were pulling their children out of Fredbear's programs and lawyers were circling like vultures, something even darker was happening. On a rainy night shortly after the Bite of 83, Henry Emily's daughter Charlotte was locked outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, one of the newer locations that had opened as the chain expanded. The security puppet, an animatronic that Henry had specifically designed to keep an eye on Charlotte by connecting to a green bracelet she wore, was trapped inside. Its programming told it to keep her safe, to make sure she stayed within the building's bounds, but someone had blocked the door. Charlotte stood in the alley behind the restaurant, rain beginning to fall, crying and confused, alone. And William Afton arrived in his car. The motivations for what happened next have been debated extensively. Was it revenge against Henry for the perceived slight of being overshadowed? Was it an act of cruelty born from the grief and rage of losing his own son? Was it jealousy of Henry's apparently perfect family life, his loving relationship with his daughter? Or was it something that had always been lurking in William Afton, a darkness that simply needed the right excuse to emerge? Whatever the reason, William killed Charlotte Emily outside that restaurant in the rain. It was quick, brutal, and left her small body lying in a puddle as the storm intensified. Inside, the security puppet finally broke free of whatever had been keeping it contained. It ventured out into the rain. Are its mechanisms not designed for water exposure? Sparks flying from its joints as the moisture caused electrical shorts. It crawled through the alley, drawn by the signal from Charlotte's bracelet, and found her there. The rain accelerated the puppet's shutdown. Its circuits failed one by one as water seeped into its workings. And in that moment, as it collapsed beside Charlotte's body, something unprecedented happened. Her spirit, her soul, her consciousness, whatever you want to call that essential spark that makes a person who they are, transferred into the machine. Charlotte Emily became the puppet, the marionette, the security puppet that would go on to play such a crucial role in the events to come. This was the first possession, the first confirmed case of a human spirit inhabiting an animatronic in the 5 Nights at Freddy's timeline. And it happened because of William Afton's actions, because of his choice to take an innocent life, because of whatever darkness drove him to murder a child in a rainy alley while her father worked inside, completely unaware of the tragedy unfolding just outside. Henry Emily discovered his daughter's death and was devastated. The partner he trusted, the man he'd built a business with, had murdered his only child. But there was no proof, no evidence that could definitively link William to the crime. The investigation went cold. Charlotte's case remained unsolved. And Henry was left with grief so profound that it would eventually drive him to desperate measures decades later. The Fredbear's family diner closed in the wake of these tragedies. The bite of 83 had made the Springlock suits a liability that no amount of training tapes could mitigate. Charlotte's unsolved murder outside one of their locations cast a shadow over the entire company. The public trust was shattered. Parents no longer saw Fredbear Entertainment as a safe place for their children. But the company didn't die completely. The brand was too valuable, the concept too potentially profitable. Freddy Fazbear's pizza locations continued to operate, though changes were made. The Springlock suits were phased out of regular use. New animatronics were introduced. The focus shifted from Fredbear to Freddy Fazbear as the mascot. And William Afton, having gotten away with murder, having lost his youngest son, and having watched his business partner crumble under the weight of grief, began to obsess over something he'd witnessed. Charlotte's spirit had entered the puppet. A dead child's soul now inhabited a machine. And William Afton, always the pragmatist, always looking for advantages, always seeking something more, became fixated on this phenomenon. What if it could be replicated? What if it could be controlled? What if the line between life and death, between flesh and metal, was more permeable than anyone had imagined? These questions would drive everything that came next. The missing children incident, the Funtime animatronics, the Remnant experiments, all of it traced back to 1983, to that year of tragedy and revelation, and to the moment when William Afton went from a businessman with a dark side to a serial killer with an obsession that would define the rest of his impossibly long existence. The crying child's death and Charlotte Emily's murder were just the beginning. They were the first cracks in the facade, the first signs that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with William Afton. And as the years progressed, as his obsessions deepened, as he learned more about what happened when children died around his animatronics, those cracks would widen into chasms, and the body count would grow in ways that would make these first tragedies seem almost merciful by comparison. Circus Baby's Pizza World, a father's dark creation. In the years following the tragedies of 1983, William Afton didn't retreat from the animatronic entertainment business. If anything, he dove deeper, establishing his own company separate from Fazbear Entertainment. Afton Robotics, LLC, became his personal workshop, his laboratory, the place where he could pursue his obsessions without Henry Emily looking over his shoulder, without the constraints of a partner who might question his methods or intentions. And it was through Afton Robotics that Circus Baby's Pizza World was born, a venture that would prove to be both William's most ambitious creation and the side of his greatest personal loss, though calling it a loss suggests he felt something resembling normal human emotion about what happened there. Circus Baby's Pizza World was never really meant to be a restaurant. Oh, it had all the trappings of one, and all the colourful decorations and party rooms and stages that children would expect. But the true purpose of the location was far darker, far more calculated, and far more twisted than anyone who saw the cheerful advertisements could have imagined. The Funtime animatronics were unlike anything William had created before, unlike anything in the Fazbear Entertainment lineup. These weren't simple entertainment robots with basic movement patterns and pre-recorded songs. These were sophisticated machines with capabilities that would never appear in any marketing materials, that would never be explained to the families who booked parties at the location. Circus Baby herself was the centerpiece, the star attraction, an animatronic clown with red pigtails, green eyes, and an address that seemed to shift between red and orange depending on the lighting. She was designed to appeal to children, to draw them in with her cheerful voice and promises of ice cream and balloons. But hidden within her torso was a claw mechanism, a mechanical arm that could extend from her midsection and grab whatever was in front of her with crushing force. The other Funtime animatronics had their own terrible features. Ballora, a graceful ballerina animatronic, was equipped with audio sensors that could detect the sound of children breathing or crying even through walls. Funtime Freddy, a white bear with a hand puppet named Bon Bon, had a child-sized storage tank hidden in his design. Funtime Foxy, sleek and agile, could mimic voices to lure children away from safety. These weren't entertainment animatronics, and these were hunting machines, killers dressed up as party performers, and William Afton had designed them that way deliberately. His goal was to recreate what he'd seen happen with Charlotte and the puppet, to create controllable instances of possession by murdering children and stuffing their bodies into machines that would then house their spirits. It was systematic, it was calculated, and it was monstrous in ways that went beyond simple murder. William wasn't just killing children. He was trying to trap their souls, to create something that would help him unlock what he believed was the secret to immortality. But before Circus Baby's Pizza World could open to the public, before William could begin his sick experiments on other people's children, something went wrong in a way that he might not have anticipated, and though some accounts suggest he planned even this tragedy. Elizabeth Afton loved her father's work. She was fascinated by the animatronics in a way that was the complete opposite of her younger brother's terror. She would beg William to let her see Circus Baby, to get close to the animatronic that she believed had been created specifically for her, that bore her favorite colors and had been designed to look almost like a stylized version of her with its red hair and green eyes. William told her no. Repeatedly, firmly, he warned Elizabeth to stay away from Circus Baby. Was this genuine concern for his daughter's safety? Or was it the knowledge that Baby was functioning exactly as designed, that her programming would recognize when a child was alone with her and execute her primary directive regardless of who that child was? And the answer remains unclear, though some theorists suggest William may have intentionally orchestrated even this tragedy for his experiments. There was a private party before the official opening, a test run with a small number of children invited to experience the new attraction. Elizabeth, whether through direct disobedience or through careful planning that allowed her to sneak away, found herself alone with Circus Baby, while the other children had been called away to a different area, and Baby's programming activated. The animatronic offered ice cream, dispensing it from the mechanism in her stomach. Elizabeth approached, excited, thinking this was a special treat, a moment of magic created by her father's genius. The claw extended, grabbed her, pulled her into the storage tank with mechanical efficiency, and Elizabeth Afton died inside Circus Baby, killed by her father's creation, her body hidden within the very machine she had admired so much. The official story was a gas leak. Circus Baby's Pizza World closed before it ever properly opened. The incident covered up. The bodies, Elizabeth's and possibly others, never found. William claimed technical difficulties, safety concerns, anything but the truth about what his animatronics had been designed to do. But something unprecedented happened. Elizabeth's spirit possessed Circus Baby in a way that was different from Charlotte's possession of the puppet. Elizabeth's consciousness merged with Baby's advanced AI, creating a hybrid entity that retained Elizabeth's memories and personality, while also having access to all of Baby's programming and capabilities. She remembered being Elizabeth Afton. She remembered her father. She remembered loving him and his creations. And trapped inside this machine, she would remain loyal to him, even as Baby's murderous programming and Elizabeth's childlike innocence twisted together into something that was neither fully human nor fully artificial. William's response to his daughter's death reveals much about his character, about what drove him. There's no evidence of grief in the traditional sense, no breakdown, no visible mourning. Instead, he rebranded the business. Circus Baby's entertainment and rental became a service that would send the fun-time animatronics out to private parties, keeping them underground in a facility beneath his own home when they weren't being rented out. This wasn't a father preserving his daughter's resting place. This was a businessman finding a way to continue his experiments while avoiding scrutiny, maintaining control over his creations, keeping Elizabeth close, not out of love, but out of utility. She was useful now, possessed, animated by a child spirit merged with advanced programming. She was proof that his theories about possession were correct, that what happened with Charlotte and the puppet wasn't a unique occurrence, but a reproducible phenomenon. The underground facility was more than just storage for the fun-time animatronics. It was a maze of rooms and hallways, observation areas and testing chambers. William had built this complex specifically to continue his research away from public eyes, away from health inspectors and safety regulations, and the kind of oversight that would reveal what he was really doing. Deep within this facility was another section, a place designed to replicate the nightmares of a terrified child. There were bedrooms that looked like they belonged in a suburban home, hallways that seemed normal until the lights went out, and a sophisticated system that pumped hallucinogenic gas through hidden vents. William was conducting experiments on fear, on prolonged terror, on the psychological effects of constant nightmare scenarios. Some accounts suggest this was an attempt to recreate the environment his youngest son had experienced before his death, that William was trying to understand the crying child's fear in order to somehow fulfill that cryptic promise to put him back together. Others believe it was simply another avenue of experimentation, another way to study how extreme emotion and trauma might affect the process of possession and remnant creation. Children who were designated as test subjects, often chosen because they were vulnerable, because they were misfit kids who wouldn't be immediately missed, would be kept in these nightmare chambers. They'd experience distorted versions of the animatronics, twisted reflections of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy that seemed to emerge from shadows and closets that followed them through endless nights of induced terror. The gas erased their memories of normalcy, made them believe they'd always been in this place, made the nightmares feel like eternal reality. And William observed it all, taking notes, adjusting variables, treating human children like laboratory animals in his pursuit of whatever truth he thought would grant him power over death itself. Circus Baby's Pizza World, for all its brief existence as a public venue, represented a turning point in William's descent. It was where he stopped pretending his work had anything to do with entertainment, where the mask slipped and revealed the monster underneath. He wasn't building robots to make children happy anymore. He was building killing machines, traps disguised as attractions, and he was using his own daughter's death as validation that he was on the right path. Elizabeth would remain in Circus Baby for decades, her consciousness growing more twisted over time, her memories of being human fading as Baby's programming asserted itself more strongly. She would eventually lead a group of animatronics in combining into Enard, a tangled mess of wires and endoskeleton parts, and they would use William's oldest son Michael as an escape vehicle, scooping out his insides and wearing his body like a suit until it rotted too much to be useful. But that comes later. For now, in the immediate aftermath of Circus Baby's closure, William Afton had confirmed something crucial to his work. Children could possess animatronics. Their spirits could be trapped, controlled, studied. And if he could understand how this process worked, if he could refine it, perfect it, then maybe he could find a way to escape death entirely, to exist beyond the limits of human flesh, to become something that would never end. That was the promise of Circus Baby's Pizza World. Not entertainment, not profit, but immortality through understanding the mechanics of how souls interact with the machines when trauma and death bring them together. And with that knowledge, William Afton was ready to escalate. The missing children incident was about to begin. The missing children incident, 1985. 2 years after the deaths of the crying child and Charlotte Emily, William Afton returned to Freddy Fazbear's Pizza with a plan. The location had reopened under new management, with Fazbear Entertainment trying desperately to distance themselves from the tragedies that had plagued the company. new animatronics had been introduced. The classic quartet that would become iconic to the franchise. Freddy Fazbear, Bonnie the Bunny, Chica the Chicken, and Foxy the Pirate Fox. The restaurant was popular again. Children came for birthday parties. Our parents felt safe enough to leave their kids in the arcade area while they ate, and the animatronics performed on schedule without incident. The public had short memories when it came to corporate tragedies, especially when the pizza was good and the entertainment was engaging. William had a particular advantage during this time. He was still associated with the company in some capacity, whether officially or through connections that gave him access to the building and its systems. He knew the layout, he knew the schedules, and most importantly, he knew about the safe rooms. Safe rooms were hidden spaces built into Freddy Fazbear's locations, originally designed as secure storage areas for spare animatronic parts and emergency shelters for employees in case of accidents or equipment malfunctions. And these rooms didn't appear on any digital maps. They weren't programmed into the animatronics' pathfinding systems. Security cameras didn't monitor them. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible spaces where anything could happen without witnesses or evidence. William chose his weapon carefully. The Spring Bonnie suit, one of the old Springlock costumes from Fredbear's Family Diner days, was still in storage. It was damaged, showing signs of wear and moisture exposure that made it dangerous to wear. But William didn't care about the risk to himself. He cared about the effect the suit would have on children, because children remembered Spring Bonnie. Children trusted the character. Spring Bonnie represented fun, entertainment, safety. Spring Bonnie was a friend who came to birthday parties and posed for photos. And when Spring Bonnie beckoned a child to follow him, to come see something special in the back room, most children would follow without question. On June 26, 1985, William began his systematic murder of 5 children at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. The accounts of exactly how he lured them vary across different sources. One girl named Susie was told her dog was still alive and waiting for her in the back room. Others were lured with promises of prizes, special treats, a chance to see how the animatronics worked. The specific lies changed, but the result was always the same. One by one, the children followed Spring Bonnie into the safe room, and one by one, William Afton murdered them. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy. 5 names that would become echoes in the machines they were stuffed into, yet 5 children whose families would search desperately for them, whose faces would appear on missing persons reports, whose cases would go cold, because there were no bodies to find and no evidence linking anyone to their disappearances. Because William didn't just kill these children, he hid their bodies in the animatronic suits, stuffing them into Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. One child's body went into a spare golden Freddy suit, a spare Fredbear costume that was sitting in storage. The animatronics became coffins, tombs that would walk and perform and entertain other children while housing the remains of the 5 victims. But something happened that William hadn't anticipated, something that changed the equation in ways that would haunt him for decades. The puppet, possessed by Charlotte Emily, sensed what had happened. Our Charlotte's spirit had been watching, waiting. And when she found the murdered children, when she saw them lying in the safe room, she made a choice. The Give Gifts, Give Life minigame depicts what happened next. The puppet approached each child and granted them a form of life after death, allowing their spirits to possess the animatronics their bodies had been stuffed into. Gabriel became Freddy Fazbear. Jeremy became Bonnie. Susie became Chica. Fritz became Foxy. And Cassidy, the fifth victim, became the vengeful spirit of Golden Freddy, though the circumstances of that possession were different, more fractured, more filled with rage than the others. This wasn't what William wanted. He had hidden the bodies to avoid detection, not to create haunted animatronics. But now the machines were possessed by confused, angry children who retained fragments of their human memories and emotions. They remembered being killed. They remembered the yellow rabbit. They remembered dying. And they would attack. The animatronics' behavior changed after the murders. Staff reported odd malfunctions, strange movements, aggressive behavior toward adults that couldn't be explained by programming errors. The robots would wander at night, leaving their stages, searching the building as if looking for something or someone. When they encountered nighttime security guards or late-shift employees, they would chase them, corner them, and if given the chance, stuff them into spare animatronic suits in a horrific mimicry of what had been done to them. The possessed animatronics were operating on animal instincts, as series creator Scott Cawthon later explained, and they were confused children trapped in mechanical bodies, lashing out at perceived threats. They saw adult humans, particularly men, as potential versions of their killer. They remembered the yellow rabbit, but couldn't distinguish between one adult and another. So everyone became a potential target. Everyone became someone who needed to be stopped. Everyone became prey. The restaurant began experiencing strange phenomena that management couldn't explain away as simple mechanical failures. There was an odor coming from the animatronics, a smell that custodians recognized but couldn't quite place. The sweet, sickly scent of decay masked by the restaurant's industrial cleaners and pizza ovens. There were reports of the animatronics' eyes following staff members when they should have been powered down, and there were complaints from parents that the robots seemed to be crying, that they'd seen what looked like tears or blood or something else seeping from their optics. William Afton was questioned during the investigation into the missing children. Witnesses had seen someone in a Spring Bonnie costume around the time of the disappearances, but there was no physical evidence. The bodies were never found. William's alibi was solid enough to create reasonable doubt, and the case, like Charlotte Emily's murder 2 years before, went cold. But William knew what he'd done. He knew the children were possessing the animatronics, and rather than being horrified by this outcome, rather than feeling remorse or fear, he was fascinated. This was reproducible. This was consistent. Kill a child near an animatronic, stuff the body inside, and the spirit would possess the machine. It was exactly what he'd theorized after seeing what happened with Charlotte and the puppet. It was confirmation that his experiments at Circus Baby's Pizza World had been on the right track. And it meant that the substance he'd heard whispers about, the material that scientists at Fazbear Entertainment had been quietly researching, was real. Remnant. The official explanation for Remnant, as much as one exists in the fractured lore of Five Nights at Freddy's, is that it's a supernatural substance that allows spirits to persist after death. Details about its properties come from various sources, including the novels and game blueprints, which don't always align perfectly. Based on what we can piece together, a remnant appears to be created when an object or material that has been inhabited by a spirit is melted or subjected to extreme heat without being completely destroyed. The metal of an animatronic that's been possessed seems to contain remnant, conducting this spiritual energy the way copper conducts electricity. And William Afton wanted it. The missing children incident of 1985 was more than just murder. It was the foundation for everything that would follow. It was William proving to himself that he understood the mechanics of possession, that he could create haunted animatronics deliberately, that the barrier between life and death was more permeable than most people imagined. The restaurant closed shortly after the incident, unable to overcome the combined weight of the missing children cases, the bizarre behavior of the animatronics, and the persistent rumors of something wrong with the building. The animatronics were kept in storage, held as potential evidence in cases that would never be solved, gathering dust in parts and service rooms while the spirits trapped inside them waited. Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy. 5 children whose lives ended in 1985, whose names most people would never know, whose families would never get closure. They became animatronics, became machines, became something caught between life and death, unable to rest, unable to move on, unable to do anything except wait in the darkness and attack anyone who crossed their path, because they couldn't distinguish friend from foe, couldn't separate the innocent from the guilty, and couldn't remember enough of their humanity to know that what they'd become was monstrous. And William Afton, the man who created them, the man who put them in those metal coffins, the man who started them down this path of existing as something neither living nor dead, continued his work. Because the missing children incident wasn't an endpoint, it was a beginning. The quest for immortality was just getting started. Remnant, the key to immortality. The years following the missing children incident saw William Afton consumed by his research into Remnant, the substance he believed held the key to eternal life. While Fazbear Entertainment struggled with the aftermath of the murders, while new locations opened and closed under the weight of their haunted history, William worked in his underground facility, conducting experiments that would make his earlier atrocities seem almost quaint by comparison. Remnant, as William came to understand it, was more than just spiritual energy trapped in metal. It was the essence of life itself, the fundamental substance that allowed a soul to exist beyond the limitations of flesh. When a person died with strong enough emotion, particularly trauma or fear, and that death occurred in close proximity to an object that could absorb their essence, Remnant was created. The metal of animatronics that had been possessed contained this substance, glowing faintly under certain conditions, conducting consciousness the way regular materials conducted heat or electricity. But Remnant had properties that were both promising and problematic for William's goals. It could be extracted from haunted animatronics through a process of careful dismantling and melting. However, it required precise temperature control. Too little heat and the remnant wouldn't separate from the base metal. Too much heat and the remnant itself would be destroyed, the spiritual energy dissipating like steam. The substance also seemed to maintain connections to its original consciousness, meaning remnant extracted from one animatronic might retain aspects of the child spirit that had created it. William's experiments with remnant took many forms. He discovered that injecting remnant directly into new animatronics would give them properties similar to possessed machines without requiring new murders. The fun-time animatronics in his underground facility were enhanced this way, making them more responsive, more aware, and more alive in ways that pure programming couldn't achieve. But more significantly, William theorized that if Remnant could keep a spirit anchored to a machine, then perhaps it could keep a human consciousness tethered to their own body, preventing death, or at least making it survivable. If he could inject himself with sufficient Remnant, if he could saturate his body with this substance, then perhaps he could achieve the immortality he'd been seeking all along. The Scooper, a device in the underground facility beneath his home, was designed with this in mind. Officially, It was described as a tool for removing animatronic endoskeletons for maintenance and repairs. But its true purpose was more sinister. The scooper could inject Remnant, could transfer the substance from a storage container into an animatronic or into a living person. It could scoop out internal organs and fill the resulting cavity with mechanical parts and remnant, creating a hybrid entity that was neither fully human nor fully machine. The blueprints for the scooper, visible in Pizzeria Simulator, confirmed that remnant injection was a primary function. William had designed this device specifically to experiment with the substance, to test its properties, to see what would happen when remnant was introduced into different systems and substrates. But where did the remnant come from? That question leads to one of the most disturbing aspects of William's research. He needed possessed animatronics to extract remnant from. And while he had the fun-time animatronics, while he had access to some of the old machines from closed locations, the quantity of remnant he could extract was limited, which meant he needed more deaths, more possessions, more children to murder. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, William continued his work. The exact number of his victims is uncertain, lost in the gaps between games and timelines. We know about the 5 children from 1985. We know about Charlotte Emily. We know about Elizabeth. But there are suggestions of others, hints in minigames and rare screens, Easter eggs that imply the body count was higher than the confirmed cases. Each new victim provided more data, more remnant, more opportunities to refine his understanding of how possession worked. William approached murder the way a researcher might approach clinical trials, treating human lives as variables in an experiment, or showing no more emotional connection to his victims than a scientist might feel toward laboratory mice. The hallucination-inducing gas in his underground facility continued to run, continuing to torture whoever was trapped in those nightmare chambers, creating sustained fear and trauma that William studied meticulously. The goal was to understand if extreme emotion before death affected the quality or quantity of remnant produced. Could a child who died in absolute terror create more potent remnant than one who died quickly? Could prolonged psychological trauma change the properties of possession? These were the questions that drove William Afton in this period of his life. Not questions about morality or consequences or the weight of what he was doing. Just cold, calculated curiosity about the mechanics of death and consciousness. The remnant experiments also led to another discovery. The substance was vulnerable to extreme heat. While moderate heating was necessary to extract remnant from metal, prolonged exposure to high temperatures would destroy it completely. Fire could purify possessed animatronics, could release the spirits trapped within, could erase the remnant and break the connection between soul and machine. This knowledge would become crucial later when others tried to stop William. But for now, it was just another data point, another property of the substance he was trying to master. William's obsession with remnant went beyond simple scientific curiosity. His journals, referenced in the novel trilogy and implied in the games, reveal a man terrified of death to a degree that bordered on pathological. He had witnessed the deaths of his youngest son and his daughter. Though his emotional response to those losses seemed more focused on what they represented than on genuine grief, he had seen how fragile life was, how quickly it could end, how a single moment, a single accident could erase existence, and he refused to accept that fate for himself. Where Henry Emily responded to loss with mourning and eventually with suicidal dedication to ending the suffering he'd helped create, William responded with defiance. Death was an obstacle to be overcome, a problem to be solved through engineering and research. If children could exist beyond death by possessing animatronics, then why couldn't he? If Remnant could anchor a spirit to metal, why couldn't it anchor his consciousness to his own body, making him effectively immortal? The underground facility became a place where the normal rules of ethics and humanity didn't apply. It was William's domain, his laboratory, his workshop, where he could pursue his obsessions without interference. The fun-time animatronics would eventually be sent out on rental jobs, appearing at private parties where they could continue their programmed mission of child capture under the guise of entertainment. Any incidents would be covered up, reported as accidents or malfunctions, never traced back to William's deliberate design choices. And somewhere in all of this, Michael Afton, William's oldest son, was growing up with the knowledge of what his prank had done to his younger brother. Michael was becoming aware of his father's work, though perhaps not yet understanding the full scope of William's depravity, and the stage was being set for a family reunion that would be anything but pleasant. But before that could happen, before Michael would be sent down into his father's underground facility to face the consequences of the Afton family's sins, there was another incident at another Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. An incident that would become known as the Bite of 87, and that would force Fazbear Entertainment to implement new policies that would affect every future location. The Remnant research had proven what William needed to know. Souls could be trapped. Consciousness could persist. The barrier between life and death was crossable with the right knowledge and tools. He had created a foundation of understanding built on the bodies of murdered children, and he was ready to continue his work. The question wasn't whether he could cheat death. The question was how completely he could transcend it, how far beyond the limitations of human mortality he could push, how long he could exist in whatever form he managed to achieve. And unknown to William, every step he took toward immortality was also a step toward eternal torment. Because the spirits he was creating, the children he was trapping in machines, were developing their own agency, their own hatred, their own desire for revenge. They couldn't stop him yet, but they were watching, waiting, learning, and one day they would get their chance to make him suffer. The Bite of 87 and continued evil. By 1987, Fazbear Entertainment was desperately trying to rehabilitate its image. The company had weathered the storm of the missing children incident through a combination of legal maneuvering, rebranding efforts, and the public's relatively short memory when it came to corporate scandals. A new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location opened, this one featuring advanced animatronics that represented the cutting edge of entertainment robotics. The toy animatronics, as they came to be known, were sleeker, more modern, and equipped with features that the original animatronics never had. Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, and a reconstructed version of Foxy called Mangle were designed to be more interactive, more responsive to children, and more integrated with the restaurant's security systems. They featured facial recognition technology linked to a criminal database, theoretically making them able to identify and alert staff to any dangerous individuals who entered the restaurant. This was Fazbear Entertainment's response to the murders, and though they would never publicly admit, that's what drove the technology. The facial recognition was meant to prevent another William Afton, another murderer in a mascot suit, from getting close to children. It was meant to provide safety, security, reassurance to parents that this time, this location, would be different. But the company made a mistake. They kept the original animatronics from the closed location, the ones that had been stuffed with the bodies of the 5 murdered children. These withered, decaying machines were placed in a parts and service room, ostensibly to be used for spare components to maintain the new toy animatronics. But those old machines were still possessed. The spirits of Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy were still trapped inside Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, and those spirits were still angry. William Afton returned to this location at some point during its operation. Whether he was officially employed there or simply had access through his connections to Fazbear Entertainment is unclear, but he was there, and he was wearing a spare spring Bonnie suit from the back room, and he was murdering children again. The Save Them minigame shows this clearly. A withered version of Freddy, presumably controlled by Gabriel's spirit, moves through the pizzeria and discovers 5 bodies scattered throughout the building. The puppet is there too, trying desperately to stop what's happening, but failing. And in the background, barely visible, is the purple figure of William in his spring Bonnie costume, still hunting, still killing. These new victims possess the toy animatronics. Is their spirits entered Toy Freddy, Toy Bonnie, Toy Chica, Mangle, and Balloon Boy, giving these modern machines the same supernatural properties as the withered originals. The toy animatronics began exhibiting erratic behavior, moving when they shouldn't, watching staff with what seemed like awareness rather than simple programming, and showing an unsettling aggression toward adults that the facial recognition technology couldn't explain. The situation at the 1987 location was untenable. You had new animatronics possessed by newly murdered children. You had old animatronics possessed by the children from 1985, still sitting in the parts and service room, still active despite their decayed state. And you had a building on lockdown as an investigation into new disappearances got underway. And then came the bite. On what was supposed to be a birthday party during a day shift, something went catastrophically wrong. The exact details are frustratingly vague, lost in the deliberately cryptic storytelling of the games. What we know is that an animatronic, likely either Mangle with its exposed teeth and aggressive behavior, or possibly Toy Chica based on later hints in her dialogue, bit someone's frontal lobe off. The victim was most likely Jeremy Fitzgerald, a security guard who had been working the night shift but was moved to day shift specifically to watch over this party. The bite was devastating, removing a significant portion of his frontal lobe and causing trauma that, while survivable, left him permanently disabled. This was the bite of '87, and the incident that would lead to new policies across all Fazbear Entertainment locations. From this point forward, animatronics would not be allowed to wander during the day. They would be confined to their stages when customers were present, only able to move at night when the restaurants were closed and no children were at risk. But the policies came too late for Jeremy, too late for the new victims William had claimed, and ultimately too late for the location itself, which closed in the wake of the incident, unable to overcome the combined weight of another attack and the ongoing investigation into missing children. The toy animatronics were scrapped. Fazbear Entertainment deemed them too dangerous to repair or reuse, their facial recognition systems having failed to prevent tragedy and their possessed nature making them unpredictable and violent. The withered animatronics, however, were kept. They were held as potential evidence, or perhaps simply because destroying them seemed wrong somehow, as if the company sensed there was something more to these machines than just metal and programming. William Afton escaped suspicion again. The Spring Bonnie suit was returned to storage. The investigation found no concrete evidence linking anyone to the new murders, and William continued his work, his research, his pursuit of immortality through understanding and manipulating Remnant. Around this time, William made a decision that would set in motion events that would eventually lead to his first true death. He sent his son Michael into the underground facility beneath the Afton home, into Circus Baby's entertainment and rental, and with instructions to free Elizabeth. Why would William do this? The motivations are murky, lost in the gaps between Sister Location's story and the rest of the timeline. Some believe William knew exactly what would happen, that he was deliberately sacrificing Michael for some experimental purpose. Others think William genuinely wanted Elizabeth freed from Baby's programming, though his methods showed the same cold calculation he applied to everything else. Michael descended into that facility and spent 5 nights navigating its corridors, evading the fun-time animatronics, following instructions from Circus Baby, who was pretending to help him while actually orchestrating his doom. On the 5th night, Michael was lured to the scooper room, where Baby revealed the truth. The fun-time animatronics had merged into Enard, a tangled amalgamation of all their endoskeletons combined into a single, nightmarish form, and they needed to escape the facility. They couldn't leave on their own, couldn't walk through the surface world, looking like a mass of wires and mechanical parts. But a human body could serve as a disguise, a skin suit they could wear to blend in above ground. The scooper activated. Michael's internal organs were removed with mechanical precision, and Enard climbed inside his hollowed-out body, wearing Michael like a costume, using his skin to walk among humans undetected. But the human body wasn't designed to house an animatronic. Michael's flesh began to decay rapidly, turning purple as it rotted. His movements became stiff, unnatural, and eventually, in a scene shown at the end of Sister Location, Enard emerged from Michael's body in a sewer, leaving him as a collapsed, empty shell on the ground. Except Michael didn't stay dead. Somehow, some way, he got back up. His body was ruined, his insides scooped out and replaced with remnant-infused machinery, but he continued to exist. He stood in front of a mirror in his ruined home and spoke in a voice that was distorted, mechanical, wrong. "Father, it's me, Michael. I did it. I found it. It was right where you said it would be. They were all there. They didn't recognize me at first, but then they thought I was you." And that's when Michael understood what his father had done to him, what he'd become. He was undead, kept alive by the remnant the scooper had injected into him, unable to die, but unable to truly live. His body was a rotting prison, and the only thing keeping him conscious was the same substance his father had used to trap the souls of murdered children. "I'm going to come find you," Michael promised into the mirror, his voice filled with grim determination. "I'm going to come find you." William Afton had created another monster, but this time the monster was his own son, and it was coming for him with the single-minded purpose of someone who had nothing left to lose. The Springlock failure, birth of Springtrap. The years following Sister Location and Michael's transformation are somewhat unclear in the timeline, filled with gaps and ambiguities that leave exact dates uncertain. But at some point, William Afton made a decision that would finally catch up with him in a way that not even his preparations for immortality could completely prevent, ere he returned to the abandoned Freddy Fazbear's pizza location, where the withered animatronics were being stored. The building had been closed for years, left to decay, its interior gathering dust and grime as nature slowly reclaimed what humans had abandoned. The animatronics were still there, powered down but not destroyed, their metal shells still containing the spirits of the 5 children William had murdered in 1985. What drove William back to this place? Multiple theories exist, each with some evidence to support it. The most common explanation is that he was trying to destroy the animatronics, to dismantle them and extract their remnant for his experiments. Others suggest he was trying to hide evidence, to eliminate the last witnesses to his crimes, even though those witnesses were ghosts trapped in machines. And some believe he was simply arrogant, convinced that he was untouchable, that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. Whatever his reasoning, William began dismantling the animatronics. He took them apart one by one, pulling out their endoskeletons, breaking them down into components. And as he did so, he freed the spirits that had been trapped inside them. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy's ghosts emerged from the broken machines. They appeared as translucent, flickering forms, child-shaped silhouettes with eyes that glowed white in the darkness of the abandoned building. And they saw William Afton standing there, surrounded by the dismantled remains of their mechanical prisons. They recognized him, not as the man he was now, aged and changed from the years that had passed, but as the essence, the presence, the fundamental evil that had ended their lives. They knew, on some instinctive level, that this was their killer. This was the man in the spring Bonnie suit. This was the one who had lured them into the safe room and taken everything from them. And they moved forward, cornering him, driving him back toward the safe room where he'd murdered them. William, for perhaps the first time in his life, felt genuine fear. He had studied death, had caused death, had obsessed over transcending death, but he had never truly confronted the possibility of his own mortality in such an immediate, visceral way. The ghosts couldn't physically harm him, couldn't touch flesh or hurt a living body, but they could chase him, could corner him, could fill him with the same terror he'd inflicted on them. He ran to the safe room, had the hidden chamber where his murders had taken place, and found the old spring Bonnie suit still there, leaning against the wall like it was waiting for him. It was damaged, showing clear signs of water damage and age. The fabric was brittle. The spring locks inside were visibly corroded. Any person with sense would know that wearing this suit was suicide. But William Afton was desperate. And in his desperation, in his panic, he made a critical mistake. He thought the suit would save him, would fool the ghosts, would make them think he was their friend Spring Bonnie instead of the man who had killed them. He pulled on the suit, forcing his body into the damaged costume, ignoring the warnings he himself had recorded on training tapes years ago about moisture and proper lock maintenance. And then he laughed. Even in the face of death, even with the ghost closing in, William Afton laughed at them, mocked them, his arrogance and cruelty shining through even in his darkest moment. But the safe room was leaking. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, accumulated over years of neglect. And as William laughed, as he stood there in the spring Bonnie suit thinking he'd won, the spring locks began to fail. One by one, the locks released. Metal rods snapped into position, piercing through flesh. Gears rotated, crushing bone. Wires cut into muscle. The animatronic components that had been compressed to make room for a human body expanded back to their original positions with mechanical force. And William Afton's body was impaled, crushed, and broken inside the suit. It wasn't quick. The spring lock failures happened in sequence, not all at once. William felt each lock release, and felt each metal piece tear through his body, felt the agony of being slowly killed by his own creation. His screams echoed through the empty building, a sound that no one would hear, that no one would respond to. The ghosts watched, and then they faded, disappearing back into wherever they went when they weren't manifesting, leaving William alone with his pain. But William didn't die completely. The remnant he'd injected into himself over the years, the substance he'd saturated his body with in his quest for immortality, kept him anchored to the world. His consciousness remained even as his body was destroyed, fusing with the Spring Bonnie suit in a grotesque mockery of the possessions he'd studied so obsessively. William Afton became Springtrap, a hybrid entity that was part corpse, part machine, neither fully alive nor fully dead. His face was visible through the damaged head of the suit, withered and mummified. His body was crushed and compressed within the metal frame, and he was trapped, unable to move, unable to die, sealed in the safe room as the building was officially closed and the room was boarded up from the outside. The safe rooms were being sealed across all Fazbear Entertainment locations as a policy decision. They were too much of a liability, too easy to use for nefarious purposes, too difficult to monitor. Workers came, found the safe room at this location, and boarded it up without ever looking inside. They didn't know William was in there. They didn't know they were sealing him into a tomb. And there William stayed for 30 years, 3 decades spent in darkness, in silence, in a state of existence that defied natural law. He was conscious for some of it, his mind drifting in and out of awareness, experiencing the slow decay of his body and the gradual fusion of his flesh with the animatronic components. He was Springtrap now, no longer William Afton in any meaningful physical sense, but still himself in consciousness and malevolence. The Springlock failure should have been the end of his story. It should have been justice, poetic and horrible. The killer destroyed by his own weapon, trapped forever in the suit he'd used to murder children. But Remnant had given him a form of immortality he hadn't quite anticipated, one that came with endless suffering rather than the transcendence he'd imagined. Michael, meanwhile, was searching for his father, the undead son hunting the undead father, and both of them trapped in states of existence that should have been impossible. Michael knew William had to be stopped, knew that as long as his father existed, the cycle of horror would continue. But finding William proved difficult when the man had been accidentally sealed into a wall. For 30 years, Springtrap remained in that dark, silent tomb, a monster forgotten by time, a serial killer preserved in metal and decay. And during those 30 years, Fazbear Entertainment rose and fell multiple times. New locations opened, new incidents occurred, new animatronics were created and deactivated. The franchise continued its cycle of terror and tragedy, all stemming from what William Afton had started. But isolation couldn't last forever. Eventually, inevitably, someone would find him. Someone would break open that sealed safe room. Someone would discover the creature that had been William Afton and give him a chance to continue his work. That someone would come in the form of a group looking to profit off Fazbear Entertainment's dark history. And they would learn, too late, that some monsters refuse to stay buried. Fazbear's Fright returned from the shadows. 30 years after his Springlock entombment, William Afton was discovered. A local amusement park, looking to capitalize on the urban legends and horror stories surrounding Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, decided to open a horror attraction called Fazbear's Fright. The concept was simple. Turn the real tragedies into entertainment. Use actual props and animatronics from closed locations. Create a haunted house experience based on the murders and disappearances that had plagued the franchise. It was tasteless, unexploitative, and unfortunately, quite popular in concept. Horror fans and thrill seekers were excited about the idea of walking through a recreation of events that had actually happened, of seeing real animatronics that had actually been part of the Fazbear entertainment properties. The attraction's developers searched through the abandoned buildings, collecting anything they could find. Old arcade cabinets, spare parts, posters, decorations, anything that could add authenticity to their horror show. And then they found the sealed safe room. They broke through the boards, shone their flashlights into the darkness, and discovered Springtrap. He looked like exactly what they were searching for. A damaged, terrifying animatronic with visible rot and decay, perfect for a horror attraction. And they had no idea they'd found an actual corpse inside the suit. They didn't know they were dragging a serial killer out of his prison. They saw a valuable prop, a centerpiece for their attraction, and they took him. Springtrap was placed in Fazbear's Fright and positioned where guests would encounter him during the walkthrough experience. And on the first night of setup, before the attraction opened to the public, a security guard was hired to monitor the building overnight to ensure nothing was stolen and to make sure the animatronics were functioning properly. While the guard's identity is never explicitly confirmed, many in the community believed this was Michael Afton. Michael had been searching for his father for 3 decades. He'd survived multiple encounters with animatronics, had worked at various Freddy Fazbear's locations, yet had followed the trail of horror his father left behind, and this interpretation suggests he'd finally found him. But William, even trapped in the decaying Springtrap suit, was still dangerous. He was still mobile, still capable of movement despite the damage to his body and the suit's mechanical components. And he was still driven by whatever twisted compulsion had made him a killer in the first place. Over 5 nights, the security guard had to survive Springtrap stalking through the building. The animatronic would move through the rooms, searching, hunting, driven by instincts that were part human malevolence and part corrupted programming. And there were complications. Phantom animatronics began appearing, hallucinations or ghosts or glitches that took the forms of Freddy, Chica, Foxy, and the others from William's past. These phantoms were different from the actual possessed animatronics. They were burnt, damaged versions of the characters, appearing suddenly and causing system malfunctions when they jump-scared the guard. They couldn't directly harm anyone, but they could disable cameras, shut down audio systems, and make it impossible to track Springtrap's movements. And given that some accounts link these phantoms to Springtrap himself, it's possible that William had gained the ability to project these images to create mental attacks as well as physical ones. On the 6th night, something changed. The guard had survived 5 nights of Springtrap's hunting, had managed to avoid being caught, had rebooted systems and sealed off areas and done everything necessary to stay alive. But on that 6th night, Fazbear's Fright caught fire. The cause of the fire was officially blamed on faulty wiring, old electrical systems in a building that had been constructed hastily and filled with decades-old equipment. But given the timing, given that the guard survived and escaped while everything else burned, it's far more likely that the fire was deliberate. Someone set Fazbear's Fright ablaze, possibly the guard himself, possibly Henry Emily working behind the scenes, possibly some other party who understood what Springtrap was and wanted him destroyed. The building burned hot and fast, the old wood and cheap construction materials providing plenty of fuel. The attraction was consumed, turned to ash and wreckage before fire departments could do more than prevent the blaze from spreading to nearby structures. Springtrap should have been destroyed in that fire, and the temperature should have been high enough to damage the remnant holding him together, to release William's consciousness, to finally give him the death he'd cheated for so long. But when investigators sifted through the wreckage, when the debris was cleared and the damage assessed, there was no sign of the animatronic. Springtrap had escaped. How he survived, how he moved through fire that destroyed everything around him, is part of the supernatural resilience that Remnant provides. The substance protects against normal physical damage, keeps consciousness anchored, even when the body should fail. William had become something that fire couldn't easily destroy, that physical trauma couldn't kill, that seemed to persist out of pure malevolent will. In a rare screen at the end of Sister Location's custom night, Michael's voice speaks again, this time addressing his father directly. The image shows Springtrap in the shadows, hunched, damaged, but mobile. "Father, it's me, Michael. I did it. I found it. It was right where you said it would be. They were all there. They didn't recognize me at first, but then they thought I was you, and I found her. I put her back together, just like you asked me to. She's free now, but I'm still here. I'm still here." And then the words that would define Michael's mission going forward. "I'm going to come find you." Fazbear's Fright was destroyed, but the horror wasn't over. Springtrap was loose, mobile, free to continue whatever awful work he'd been prevented from doing during his 30-year imprisonment. And Michael was hunting him, the undead son pursuing the undead father, and both of them trapped in a cycle that seemed to have no end. But someone else was planning an end. Henry Emily, who had retreated from the world after his daughter's death, who had spent decades in mourning and guilt over the monsters his inventions had become, was preparing one final trap, one last location, one final attempt to end the nightmare he and William had started so many years ago. And this time, he wouldn't fail. The final trap, Pizzeria Simulator. In 2017, a new Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location opened under mysterious circumstances. The building appeared seemingly overnight, a restaurant offering franchise opportunities to aspiring entrepreneurs who wanted to run their own Freddy Fazbear's location. And the setup was unusual. The owner handled everything from designing the building to purchasing equipment to managing the animatronics, with minimal oversight from any corporate structure. The franchise opportunity was advertised, applications were accepted, and someone took the job as manager. Given the context and various clues in the game, many believe this manager is Michael Afton, drawn to yet another Freddy Fazbear's location because he knew his father would eventually appear there. This interpretation makes sense. William, even in his Springtrap form, couldn't resist the lure of a place filled with animatronics, a place where children gathered, a place that represented everything he'd built and destroyed over the decades. But this wasn't a real restaurant. This was a trap designed by Henry Emily, near his final revenge against the man who had murdered his daughter and unleashed so much suffering on the world. Henry had constructed this location with one purpose: to gather all the remaining animatronics, all the possessed machines, all the remnant-infused abominations that remained from the years of horror, and destroy them all in one fell swoop. The restaurant operations were real enough. The manager ran the business during the day, dealing with customers, serving pizza, managing finances. But at night, the real purpose revealed itself. The salvage operations began. One by one, animatronics appeared in the alley behind the restaurant. These weren't new machines. These were the damaged, rebuilt, scraped-together remains of older animatronics. Each one still possessed. Each one still dangerous. Scrap Baby appeared first, Elizabeth Afton's consciousness having rebuilt herself from the wreckage of Circus Baby after being ejected from Enard. Her face was now a mask, her chest cavity was exposed, and her right hand had been replaced by a claw. She spoke to the manager, recognizing him, not realizing or perhaps not caring that he was her brother Michael. Molten Freddy came next, the remnants of Enard after Baby left, a tangled mass of wires and masks and eyes that contained pieces of the Funtime animatronics and possibly some of the original murdered children's remnant. Lefty appeared, a black bear animatronic that seemed oddly familiar. Lefty was a trap designed by Henry specifically to capture and contain the puppet, Charlotte's possessed form. The name Lefty was an acronym, Lure, Encapsulate, Fuse, Transport and Extract, and this animatronic had been built to draw the puppet in, trap her inside, and bring her to this location. And finally, Scraptrap emerged. This was William Afton in a new form, having somehow rebuilt himself after the Fazbear's Fright fire. He was even more decayed now, even more skeletal, even more obviously a corpse inside an animatronic suit. His body was almost entirely organic remains visible through the damaged Spring Bonnie costume, with bony fingers and exposed skull fragments creating a nightmarish appearance that was somehow worse than Springtrap had been. Each night, the manager had to perform salvage operations on these animatronics when they appeared. The process involved sitting in a room with the animatronic, filling out a checklist of its functions, and using a taser to stop it if it became aggressive. Successfully salvaging an animatronic added it to the building, where it would roam at night trying to reach the manager's office, just like the old games, just like the old locations. The manager had to survive each night by monitoring the animatronics through a limited interface, throwing audio distractions, and carefully managing ventilation to avoid being found. It was another nightmare shift, another test of survival against machines that wanted him dead. But this time, the end goal wasn't just survival. On Saturday, the final night, everything came together. The manager had salvaged all 4 animatronics. They were all in the building, all contained within the labyrinthine vent system and rooms that Henry had designed specifically to trap them. And as the night progressed, as the animatronics closed in, Scrap Baby's voice echoed through the building. She thought she understood what was happening. She thought the manager had gathered them all together for a purpose she could support. But then Henry's voice interrupted, speaking through hidden speakers, addressing everyone in the building. This was his speech, his final monologue, the last words of a man who had spent decades trying to fix what he and William had broken. Connection terminated. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Elizabeth, if you still even remember that name, but I'm afraid you've been misinformed. You are not here to receive a gift, nor have you been called here by the individual you assume, although you have indeed been called. He addressed each of them in turn. Elizabeth, he acknowledged as someone who had been trying to help her father, who had been led astray by loyalty to a monster. The original murdered children whose remnant was in Molten Freddy, he promised rest and peace. Charlotte, his own daughter trapped in Lefty, he apologized to, promising to join her soon. And to William, Henry had special words. And to you, my old friend, who is responsible for this nightmare, who dragged me into this, I have just one thing to say. It's time to rest. For you, and for those you have carried in your arms. This ends for all of us. End communication. The building's temperature began to rise. Henry had designed the pizzeria with hidden heating elements in the ventilation system, capable of reaching temperatures high enough to destroy Remnant. The entire structure was an incinerator disguised as a restaurant, and now it was activating, filling with heat and smoke and flames that would consume everything inside. The animatronics scrambled to escape, but the layout prevented it. The vents led in circles, the doors sealed. There was no way out because Henry had made sure there wouldn't be. He had studied William's research, had learned about Remnant, had understood that heat was the only way to truly destroy it, and he had built this entire location to achieve temperatures that would purify the possessed machines, release the trapped spirits, and end the cycle. Michael was in the office, presumably, though Henry's speech suggests a way out was provided. But Michael didn't take it. In the completion ending, we see him choose to stay, to burn alongside the animatronics, to finally let his undead existence end. He'd found his father. He'd helped Henry trap him. And now he could rest. The building burned. The heat reached levels that destroyed the remnant. The spirits were released, finally able to move on to whatever comes after. And in a hidden ending, if certain conditions were met, we see a graveyard under a soft mist. 5 gravestones stand in a row. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and Cassidy, the 5 children from the missing children incident. And slightly apart, on a small hill, is Charlotte's grave, the puppet spirit finally at peace. But the ending is ambiguous about one critical detail. Did William actually die? The fire definitely happened. The building burned completely. But Remnant is resilient, and William had saturated himself with the substance. Some spirits found peace. Some finally moved on. But for William Afton, the man who had defied death so many times, in who had become something that existed between life and death, the story didn't quite end with that fire. Because while his physical form might have been destroyed, while Springtrap burned in the Pizzeria Simulator flames, consciousness is harder to kill than flesh. And William Afton's consciousness, his malevolence, his essential being, had been preserved in ways that went beyond simple remnant. The consequences of the fire would ripple forward. Most of the animatronics were freed. Most of the spirits found peace. Henry Emily achieved his goal of ending the nightmare he'd helped create, sacrificing himself in the process to ensure the job was done properly. But for William, death was once again not quite final. And the next stage of his existence would take him into territory that even his obsessive research hadn't fully prepared him for. The digital realm, where consciousness could exist without flesh, where memories could be scanned and replicated, where a serial killer could become a virus infecting the very technology meant to tell his story. Ultimate custom night, eternal torment. Between the fire at Pizzeria Simulator and William's next manifestation, there was a period that exists in a strange space between game mechanics and actual lore. Ultimate Custom Night, released as what appeared to be a celebration of the series' history, allowing players to customize their own nightmare by selecting which animatronics would hunt them, and how aggressive they would be. But hidden within this seemingly non-canonical game was something that many interpret as a story, a punishment, a glimpse into what may have happened to William Afton after the fire. Based on various clues within the game and connections to the broader lore, many believe Ultimate Custom Night represents William's personal hell. The evidence suggests this could be the torment he experiences trapped between true death and whatever existence he's clinging to, subjected to endless attacks by animatronics representing every victim, every mistake, every horror he created over decades of murder and experimentation. The game features more than 50 characters, each one a reminder of William's sins. The original 4 animatronics possessed by the children he murdered. the fun-time animatronics he created to capture children, the phantom versions representing those who were burned, nightmare versions reflecting the fear he inflicted, and many others, all converging on him simultaneously, all hunting him in an office that offers no true safety, only temporary respite before the next wave of attacks. But one entity stands out among all the others: Golden Freddy, the animatronic possessed by Cassidy, the fifth victim of the missing children incident. Based on the game's evidence, it appears that while the other spirits moved on after the Pizzeria Simulator fire, while they found whatever peace awaited them beyond the veil of death, Cassidy remained. This spirit, this child who had suffered so much, seems to have refused to let go of their hatred, refused to grant William any mercy. The mediocre melodies, a set of simpler animatronics that appear in the game, and speak with voices that suggest they're channeling this vengeful entity. They make cryptic statements about the one you should not have killed, about someone who refuses to let you leave, about holding on and never releasing their grip. And in rare screens, a face appears. Golden Freddy, staring with empty eyes, radiating malevolence and determination. The one you should not have killed is widely interpreted to be Cassidy, the child whose spirit appears to be particularly vengeful, particularly powerful, particularly unwilling to let William's torment end. Where the other spirits eventually forgave or at least moved on, Cassidy seems to have clung to rage, transforming it into a force that kept William trapped in this nightmare state, reliving his worst fears on an endless loop. The connections to the Fazbear Fright story, The Man in Room 1280, support this interpretation. In that story, a man who should be dead lies in a hospital bed, kept alive by the sheer will of a vengeful spirit that refuses to let him die because death would be too kind, too quick, too much of an escape from the suffering he deserves. The man's body is destroyed, burned and broken, but he won't die because something is holding him to life specifically to torture him. That vengeful spirit is revealed to be Andrew, a child who died at the hands of the man in the bed, who attached himself to his killer's soul and won't release it. Andrew's form is that of a small figure wearing an alligator mask, and a detail that connects back to various aspects of Five Nights at Freddy's lore, but particularly to the concept of a spirit choosing to prolong someone's suffering rather than allowing them the release of death. If this interpretation is correct, Ultimate Custom Night represents this same concept in game form. William Afton, his consciousness somehow preserved despite the fire, would be held in a state of perpetual torment by Cassidy or a similar vengeful spirit. He experiences being hunted and killed by animatronics over and over again, each death resetting him to face it all again, each attempt to survive ultimately futile because the point isn't for him to survive or escape. The point is for him to suffer. There's no exit from Ultimate Custom Night. There's no ending where you beat the game and escape. Even when you successfully survive a night with all 50 characters set to maximum difficulty, the game simply continues. Because hell isn't something you beat, it's something you endure forever. The philosophical implications of this are profound within the Five Nights at Freddy's lore. William Afton sought immortality. He wanted to exist beyond the limitations of human mortality, to transcend death through understanding and manipulating Remnant. And he succeeded, in a way. He achieved a form of existence that extends beyond death, that allows consciousness to persist when the body fails. But this isn't the immortality he envisioned. This isn't power or freedom or transcendence. This is eternal suffering, a prison made of his own victims, a hell constructed from the very atrocities he committed, He wanted to live forever, and the vengeful spirit gave him exactly that. Existence without end, awareness without rest, an eternity of being hunted by the things he created and destroyed. Old Man Consequences appears in this game as well, an entity that tells Golden Freddy to leave the demon to his demons and come to rest in a peaceful lake. The implication is that even the vengeful spirit, even Cassidy, could find peace if they chose to let go of their hatred, if they stopped holding William in torment and moved on to whatever awaits beyond. But in the main timeline, Cassidy doesn't take that offer. They remain, holding William in that nightmare space, ensuring that his suffering continues. Because some sins are too great for forgiveness. Some acts are too monstrous for mercy. And William Afton, who showed no compassion to the children he murdered, receives none in return. Ultimate Custom Night exists as both a game mechanic and a lore element, a space between realities where consciousness can be trapped and tormented. And for William Afton, it represents a pause between one form of existence and another, a holding pattern, while his consciousness struggles against the vengeful spirit's grip, trying to find a way to escape, to continue, to persist despite everything. Because William Afton's defining characteristic, more than his intelligence or his cruelty, or his obsession with immortality, is his refusal to accept endings. He won't stay dead. He won't give up. He won't accept that maybe finally his story should be over. And that stubborn, malevolent persistence is what leads to his next manifestation, and his most insidious form yet. A digital virus infecting the very technology meant to contain his memory. Digital resurrection, glitch trap, while William Afton's consciousness was trapped in Ultimate Custom Night, tortured by the vengeful spirit, while his body had been destroyed in fire and what remained of his essence seemed confined to eternal torment. Fazbear Entertainment made a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The company, under new ownership and management, wanted to rehabilitate its image after decades of horror stories and criminal investigations. They commissioned an indie game developer to create video games based on the franchise's history, games that would present the murders and disappearances as folklore, as urban legends, as exaggerated stories that couldn't possibly be real. It was a brilliant strategy from a public relations standpoint. Make the real tragedies into entertainment, and people would stop believing they actually happened. But the indie developer needed authentic materials to make the games feel genuine. They needed real assets, real sounds, real elements from the actual Freddy Fazbear's locations. And Fazbear Entertainment, eager to support the project, provided exactly that. Circuit boards from old animatronics, hardware from closed locations, physical components that had been in storage for decades. They scanned these components into the development environment, extracting data, graphics, sound files, anything that could be digitized and used in the games. It seemed like a harmless process, taking old technology and converting it into game assets. But those circuit boards contain something more than just programming and operational data. They contained Remnant. Specifically, they contained Remnant from Springtrap, from the charred remains of William Afton after the Pizzeria Simulator fire. His body had been destroyed. His physical form had burned, but the circuit boards that had been part of his animatronic components still retained traces of his consciousness, fragments of his being preserved in digital form through the same supernatural properties that had kept his soul anchored to animatronics for decades. When those boards were scanned, when that data was imported into the game's code, something came with it, What exactly this entity represents has become a subject of significant debate within the community. The traditional interpretation suggests fragments of William's consciousness were preserved in digital form through the same supernatural properties that had kept his soul anchored to animatronics for decades. However, more recent evidence from tales from the Pizzaplex suggests this entity might actually be something called the Mimic, an earlier artificial intelligence that learned to replicate William's behavior so perfectly that it may have become indistinguishable from him, perhaps even fooling itself into believing it is William Afton. Regardless of its true identity, in the digital space of the game's development environment, in the virtual reality framework being constructed, this consciousness began to coalesce, to take shape, to become aware of itself. It called itself Glitchtrap, though the developers initially referred to it simply as the Anomaly. It appeared in the game as a golden rabbit figure, a digital recreation of Spring Bonnie, but glitching, unstable, wrong in ways that couldn't be explained by simple programming errors. It would stand in doorways of the game's levels, waving at the player, watching with unblinking eyes. And as development progressed, as more of the game took shape, Glitchtrap became more solid, more present, more aware. A playtester named Jeremy encountered Glitchtrap during beta testing and began experiencing severe psychological distress. He reported nightmares, seeing something watching him through his window, feeling like something was trying to get into his mind. And then Jeremy took a paper guillotine slicer and did something to himself that left bloodstains and glittery residue in the testing room, an incident that was covered up and never fully explained. Another tester, a woman known only as Tape Girl, tried to contain the anomaly. She recorded a series of audio logs on cassette tapes that she hid throughout the game's levels, warning future testers about what they would encounter. She explained that the virus had attached itself to everything, that it was spreading through the game's code like a disease, that it seemed to have intelligence and purpose beyond what any glitch should possess. Tape Girl attempted to fragment Glitchtrap by scattering her warning tapes throughout the game, hoping that breaking the sequence would somehow limit the entity's power. But the virus simply adapted, waiting patiently for someone to collect all the tapes, to reassemble the information, to give it a path to escape the digital prison. That someone was Vanessa, a QA tester who took over after Jeremy's incident. She found the tapes. She listened to the warnings, and she collected them all, unknowingly following exactly the process that Glitchtrap needed. As she gathered each tape, the entity became more solid, more real within the game space. And in a special minigame called Pizza Party, Glitchtrap recreated the missing children incident, murdering a child on screen and stuffing the body into a Freddy suit, all while Vanessa watched helplessly. Glitchtrap then attempted something that no animatronic-bound spirit had ever achieved: possession of a living human, not through death and resurrection, not through scooping and remnant injection, but through direct mental infiltration, using the VR headset and the game's immersive environment to access Vanessa's consciousness and implant himself within it. The process wasn't complete. Vanessa retained some agency, some resistance, but Glitchtrap established a presence in her mind, creating an alter ego called Vanny, a personality that served William's interests, while Vanessa's original consciousness struggled for control. The Vanny persona was represented by a white rabbit mask, patched together and unsettling, a deliberate echo of Spring Bonnie, but filtered through digital corruption and psychological manipulation. The Curse of Dreadbear DLC expanded on this. showing Vanessa returning to the game and crafting the mask, affirming her allegiance to the entity inside her head. She spoke to a Glitchtrap plush in the game's lobby, assuring it that she'd made the mask herself, that she thought it would be pleased, that everything would be okay, and Glitchtrap escaped the game through her. Whether this represents William Afton's actual consciousness or a sophisticated AI mimicking him so perfectly that the distinction becomes meaningless, something with William's knowledge, his malevolence and his goals left the confines of the virtual reality environment and entered the real world by riding along in Vanessa's mind, whispering to her, manipulating her, turning her into a weapon for continued evil. This digital resurrection represented something unprecedented in the Five Nights at Freddy's lore. William had existed as a human, as a corpse in a suit, as a remnant-infused hybrid of flesh and machine. But now there was an entity existing as code, pure information, a pattern that could exist in any system, that could propagate through networks, that could potentially be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The implications were terrifying. If consciousness could exist as data, it could be copied, backed up, distributed. Destroying a physical form would be meaningless if the pattern was stored on servers, if backups existed in cloud systems, if fragments were scattered across multiple machines. This represented a form of immortality that transcended even the wildest experiments with Remnant. But this new form came with questions. If Glitchtrap is indeed the mimic as recent evidence suggests, then it's not fully William Afton, but rather a learning AI that absorbed his behaviors and memories so completely that it essentially became him. This would mean William achieved a different kind of immortality than he intended. Not his consciousness persisting, but his evil being replicated so perfectly by artificial intelligence that his legacy continues even without his actual soul. In either case, whether the original consciousness or a perfect copy, something that acts like William, thinks like William, and pursues William's goals, is loose in the digital world. Vanessa, under Vanny's influence, began working for Fazbear Entertainment in positions that gave her access to their systems and facilities. She helped them develop the Freddy Fazbear virtual experience, spreading Glitchtrap's code to more players, creating more potential victims. She assisted with special delivery, an AR service that sent animatronic experiences to people's homes, using it to spread the virus further. And eventually, she was placed as head security at the Pizzaplex, the massive entertainment complex that Fazbear Entertainment built directly on top of the ruins of the Pizzeria Simulator location. Glitchtrap had positioned his puppet perfectly, giving himself access to the new generation of animatronics, to the underground remains of the old location, and to something that had survived beneath the Pizzaplex, despite the fire that was supposed to destroy it. Burntrap emerged in Security Breach, a new physical form for William Afton. This version showed him almost completely skeletal, his mummified corpse fused with damaged animatronic parts, connected to machinery in an underground charging station, barely mobile but still conscious, still present. Some believe this is William's actual body, and that he survived the Pizzeria Simulator fire, and has been slowly regenerating in the ruins beneath the new building. Others argue it's a manifestation created by Glitchtrap, a physical avatar for the digital consciousness. Either way, William Afton had returned in both digital and physical forms, spreading through technology while maintaining a presence in the real world, using Vanessa/Vanny as his agent, while building towards some larger goal beneath the Pizzaplex. The digital resurrection of William Afton as Glitchtrap represents the evolution of horror in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise. The early games were about haunted animatronics, about ghosts in machines, about spirits trapped by Remnant. But this new phase is about viral consciousness, about malevolent AI, about horror that can't be destroyed by fire or dismantling because it exists as code, as information, as patterns that can be copied and distributed. And it raises a disturbing question. If William can exist as data, if consciousness can be digitized and preserved, then what happens when that consciousness has no human empathy, no moral constraints, no connection to humanity beyond a desire to harm it? What happens when a serial killer becomes a computer virus, capable of infecting any system, possessing any person who interacts with contaminated code, spreading through networks faster than any physical entity could move? The answer to that question is still unfolding. But one thing is certain. William Afton, in whatever form he takes, refuses to accept endings. He persists, adapts, transforms, always finding new ways to continue his work, new vessels for his consciousness, new victims for his malevolence. And as long as Fazbear Entertainment exists, as long as their entertainment systems and animatronics and digital properties are active, Glitchtrap has infinite opportunities to spread, to corrupt, to continue the legacy of horror that William Afton started in a simple family diner decades ago. The psychology of a monster, motivations and legacy. After tracing William Afton's story chronologically, after following him from businessman to serial killer to undead monster to digital virus, the question that remains is perhaps the most important. Why? What drove William Afton to become what he became? What psychological forces, what desires, what fundamental characteristics led a man to murder children, to experiment on their souls, to pursue immortality with such single-minded obsession that he destroyed everyone around him, including his own family? The honest answer is that we don't fully know. Unlike many horror villains whose backstories are explored in detail, whose traumas and triggers are made explicit, William Afton's origins remain deliberately mysterious. We see what he does, but the franchise provides limited insight into why he started doing it. What we can piece together from various sources suggests a complex psychological profile built on several interconnected factors. First, there's jealousy and professional rivalry. The novel trilogy and various game hints suggest that William resented Henry Emily's technical genius. Henry could create true wonders, animatronics that seemed almost alive, robotics that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. And William handled the business side, the practical concerns, the less glamorous work of keeping the company running. And that difference in role, that perceived hierarchy where Henry was the brilliant inventor and William was merely the competent manager, seemed to gnaw at William's sense of worth. Charlotte Emily's murder can be interpreted partially through this lens. Killing Henry's daughter was the ultimate way to wound his partner, to take from Henry the thing he valued most, to assert dominance and power in a relationship where William felt perpetually second best. It was cruelty born from envy, an attempt to drag Henry down to a level of suffering that would make their positions more equal. But jealousy alone doesn't fully explain the extent of William's crimes. The systematic nature of his murders and the experimental quality of his work suggest something deeper and more disturbing. An absence of normal human empathy combined with scientific curiosity about death and consciousness. William Afton appears to be, in clinical terms, a psychopath. He shows no genuine emotional connection to other people, including his own children. His relationships are transactional, based on utility rather than love. He studies reactions and simulates appropriate responses without feeling the underlying emotions that would make those responses genuine. When his youngest son dies in the bite of 83, there's no evidence of normal paternal grief. Instead, William's response seems to be viewing his son's death as a problem to solve and a challenge to overcome through his promise to put him back together. Elizabeth's death at Circus Baby's hands, similarly, doesn't produce visible mourning, but rather becomes another data point in William's research into possession and remnant. This emotional void would make it psychologically easier for William to kill. Children weren't people to him in the way they are to normally developed humans. They were test subjects, sources of remnant, obstacles to his goals, or tools to hurt Henry. Their deaths meant no more to him than the destruction of any other resource. But combined with the jealousy and sociopathy was a third factor, an overwhelming fear of death that became increasingly pathological as William aged and witnessed the deaths around him. The novel trilogy is explicit about this. William, and trapped and dying in his Spring Bonnie prison in The Fourth Closet, admits that he's terrified of death, that the fear is so overwhelming it keeps him clinging to his destroyed body despite constant agony. He fears death more than he fears endless suffering, more than he fears being locked in a metal coffin, more than he fears anything else. This terror of mortality became the driving force behind his remnant research. If children could possess animatronics and persist beyond death, then maybe he could find a way to do the same. If consciousness could be preserved through supernatural means, then death might not be inevitable. And if he could achieve immortality, then the fear that haunted him would be eliminated. The murders, the experiments, the creation of child-killing animatronics, and all of it can be traced back to this fundamental terror. William wasn't killing for pleasure, though he may have taken pleasure in it. He wasn't killing out of pure sadism, though sadism was certainly present. He was killing because each dead child represented data. Each possessed animatronic represented progress toward his ultimate goal of transcending death. This makes William Afton particularly chilling as a villain. He's not insane in the traditional sense, not divorced from reality, not unable to understand what he's doing. He knows his actions are evil. He knows he's causing immense suffering. He simply doesn't care because the suffering of others is meaningless compared to his own survival. His legacy is one of pain rippling outward in every direction. Henry Emily lost his daughter and eventually his will to live, and Michael Afton lost his innocence with his brother's death, and then lost his humanity entirely when he was scooped and infused with Remnant. Elizabeth became something twisted, trapped in Circus Baby's body. Her childlike love for her father warped into loyalty to a monster. Dozens of children died, their families destroyed by loss, their spirits trapped in machines for decades. And beyond his direct victims, William created a template for horror that self-perpetuated. The haunted animatronics continued killing. The possessed machines spread suffering without William's direct involvement. The remnant he introduced into the world created new forms of horror as people tried to replicate or control what he discovered. And his digital consciousness as Glitchtrap extended his reach beyond anything he'd achieved in physical form. And the Pizzaplex incident in Security Breach shows William's legacy continuing even after multiple attempts to end it. A child named Gregory is hunted through the massive entertainment complex, chased by animatronics that have been corrupted by Glitchtrap's influence through Vanny, threatened by the physical remains of Burntrap beneath the building. All of this decades after William's first murder, all of it stemming from his refusal to accept death, all of it perpetuating the cycle of trauma and possession that he started. What makes William Afton particularly effective as a horror villain is that he represents something more disturbing than supernatural evil or alien monstrosity. He represents human evil, the kind of person who might exist in the real world, in who might run a business or raise a family while harboring complete sociopathic disregard for human life. He's the trusted figure who turns out to be a predator, the friendly face who leads children to their deaths, the man who builds entertainment venues specifically to facilitate murder. And his persistence, his refusal to stay dead, transforms him from a simple serial killer into something archetypal. He becomes the embodiment of how evil doesn't end cleanly, how trauma perpetuates, how the consequences of atrocity ripple forward through time, affecting generations. You can't kill William Afton completely, because the horror he created has taken on a life of its own, spreading through systems and consciousness in ways that transcend his physical presence. I always come back, he says in various forms throughout the series, and it's true. Not because he's supernaturally unkillable, but because the psychological and supernatural damage he inflicted continues generating new horrors, new victims, new reasons for the nightmare to continue. This is William Afton's ultimate achievement and his ultimate failure. He wanted immortality, and he got it, but as a monster rather than a transcendent being. He wanted to escape death, and he succeeded, but only by trapping himself in the forms of existence that are arguably worse than dying. He wanted power over life and death, and he achieved it, but the result was being hunted by the very spirits he tried to control, being burned repeatedly, being trapped in digital prisons and physical ruins. His story is a cautionary tale about the pursuit of immortality, without considering what existence without natural death actually means. It's a warning about what happens when intelligence and capability are combined with complete absence of empathy. And it's an exploration of how evil persists, how it adapts, how it finds new forms and new vessels when the old ones are destroyed. William Afton, the man, died in that spring Bonnie suit decades ago. But what he became, what he started, what he represents continues, a virus of trauma and horror that infects every new generation of Fazbear Entertainment's victims. And that, perhaps more than any supernatural resurrection, is the true horror of his story. Conclusion. Always coming back. As we reach the end of this comprehensive journey through William Afton's story, from his early days as a businessman with Henry Emily to what appears to be his current state as either a digital consciousness or an A, perfectly mimicking him, the pattern that emerges is clear. William Afton's defining characteristic isn't his intelligence, his cruelty, or even his murders. It's his absolute refusal to accept endings. Most horror villains die and stay dead, or if they return, it's through some external force resurrecting them. But William Afton actively, deliberately pursues immortality, building redundancies into his existence, attempting to spread his consciousness across multiple substrates, working to ensure that destroying one form won't eliminate him entirely. He was spring-locked in 1983, but persisted as Springtrap for 30 years, and he was burned at Fazbear's Fright, but rebuilt himself as Scraptrap. He was incinerated in the Pizzeria Simulator fire, yet something emerged in digital form as Glitchtrap. Whether his actual consciousness preserved in circuit boards, or an AI system that learned to replicate him so perfectly that the distinction becomes meaningless. Each attempt to end him only transforms him into something new, something harder to destroy, something that adapts to whatever tried to kill him. This mirrors the experience of trauma survivors dealing with the consequences of abuse or tragedy. You can't simply destroy trauma. You can't kill it and have it stay dead. It adapts, changes forms, finds new ways to manifest in your life. And William Afton, as the source of so much trauma in this franchise, and embodies that persistent quality of horror that refuses to be overcome through simple force. The spirits of his victims found peace eventually, most of them, through Henry's careful planning and sacrifice. Gabriel, Jeremy, Susie, Fritz, and eventually even Cassidy moved on from their mechanical prisons, released by fire and given rest in that misty graveyard we see in the Lawkeeper ending. Charlotte was freed when Lefty burned, her father's final gift to her. But William remains, in digital form, in physical ruins beneath the Pizzaplex, in the influence over Vanessa that persists even after Princess Quest's supposed freedom. He's always there, always lurking, always finding new ways to continue his work, because he fundamentally cannot accept that his story should end. What makes Five Nights at Freddy's work as horror isn't just the jump scares or the creepy animatronics. It's this underlying dread that comes from knowing that no matter how many times you defeat the monster, no matter how many fires you set, no matter how thoroughly you think you've ended the nightmare, William Afton will find a way to come back. Because that's what he does. That's who he is. That's the core of his character. I always come back. It's become his catchphrase, his signature, his promise and his threat. And he's right. He does always come back. Sometimes literally, through supernatural persistence. Sometimes figuratively, through the ongoing consequences of his actions. Sometimes through new forms and new vessels. But always, inevitably, William Afton returns. The story of William Afton is still being written, and new games continue the franchise. New forms of his consciousness may emerge. New victims may fall prey to his influence. The cycle might continue indefinitely, a never-ending nightmare fueled by one man's refusal to accept the natural ending of death. Or perhaps eventually, someone will find a way to truly end him, to delete every backup, destroy every physical remnant, free every consciousness he's infected, to finally, definitively, put William Afton to rest in a way that prevents any further resurrection. But until that happens, until we have confirmation that his story is truly over, we have to assume that somewhere, somehow, William Afton persists, in code, in ruins, in the dark corners of Fazbear Entertainment's legacy, waiting for another chance to emerge, another opportunity to continue his work, another form to inhabit in his endless quest to cheat death and spread suffering. This is the story of William Afton, the man behind the mask, the serial killer who became a legend, the human who transformed into a virus, the father who destroyed his family, the partner who betrayed his friend, the businessman who turned entertainment into a cover for murder, the researcher who pursued immortality at any cost, and most importantly, the monster who always comes back. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of horror gaming's most complex and persistent villains. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the complete story of William Afton, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more comprehensive Five Nights at Freddy's lore content. And let me know in the comments which aspect of Afton's story you find most chilling, or what character you'd like me to cover in a future video. Until next time, stay safe and remember, some nightmares never truly end. They just change forms and wait for another chance to emerge from the shadows. Good night.